When 1815 began, Napoleon Bonaparte was living in exile on the Mediterranean island of Elba. But he was becoming increasingly restless and bored. Meanwhile, in France, the Bourbon monarch was becoming increasingly unpopular, and many longed for the glory days of Napoleon's reign as emperor. Born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, Napoleon was one of 8 children, born to a lawyer and wife who instilled in him a sense of duty and valour that would see him rise through the military to lead the army of France in its conquest of Italy. Napoleon, believing himself great and that only he could lead France, through his popularity as a dashing general and a combination of luck and intrigue, he proclaimed himself emperor in December 1804. There followed 10 years of almost continuous warfare, as France became the dominant power on mainland Europe. Napoleon's armies in the field crushed those of Prussia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russia and Spain. His invasion of Russia in 1812 would lead to the capture of Moscow, but it proved a hollow victory, the Russians having evacuated the city and refusing to come to terms with France. Napoleon was left with little choice but in October 1812 to retreat back to France. The disaster cost him some 570,000 men, more than 2,000 horses and over 1,000 artillery pieces. It was one of the greatest military disasters ever to befall an army. He would never recover from this loss, and over the next 2 years his forces were slowly ground down by the Allies, forcing him to abdicate on April the 14th, 1814. On February the 26th, 1815, whilst the British governor of Elba was visiting his mistress on the Italian coast, Napoleon and 1,000 of his imperial guard slipped away and headed for the south of France. From there he marched to Paris and gathered the army around him, declaring himself emperor on March the 20th for the second time. There, knowing the European powers around him were mobilising against him, he raised an army and decided to attack the Allies and the Prussians in the Netherlands. His plan was to strike a path between the two armies and deal with them one at a time, preventing them from forming a united front. On June the 15th, he crossed the Samoa River near Charleroi and divided his army into 2. One force of 42,000 men marched up the Brussels road to meet the Allies. The rest of his army, under Napoleon's control, marched to Ligny to meet the Prussian army. When darkness fell that day, the Prussians were beaten and retreated north. Quatre Bras, where the British had fought the French, had held. British, German and Dutch regiments had marched across the Netherlands all through the day to join the battle, and despite heavy casualties, they had held firm. The Duke of Wellington, who commanded the Allies, realised that with the Prussians in retreat, he too would have to fall back if the two armies were to come to each other's aid. And on the 17th of June, despite almost continuous heavy rain, his army was moved back to a preordained place he had reconnoitred many years before around a small hamlet called Waterloo. On Sunday, the 18th of June, the French army faced the Allies, whilst Napoleon had dispatched some 30,000 troops to find Blucher and the Prussians and prevent them from joining the battle. At around 11 in the morning, a French artillery bombardment began. Allez! The battlefield stretched over a 3-mile area, over gentle farmland, with Wellington's line atop a low ridge anchored by 3 farmhouses. To the right, the fortified farm of Hougoumont, in the centre, La Haye-Sainte, and to the right, the farm at Pampelette. At around 11:30 that morning, French infantry attacked the fortified farm at Hougoumont which was held by regiments of foot guards and Coldstream Guards, some of Wellington's best troops. And despite the French sending some 3 divisions during the course of the day, the English held firm. At around 1:30, the main infantry attack began, with great columns of infantry steadily marching on the slope towards Wellington's forces. Despite the English line being only 2 deep at the height of the attack, they held firm. And as the French columns faltered and stopped, British heavy cavalry were sent after them. Some 2,000 British heavy cavalry tore into the infantry, and they fled back to the French lines. The heroic charge of the British cavalry, including the famous Scots Greys, unfortunately allowed their ardour to get the better of them, and they failed to heed the call to stop and return to the British lines. They continued down the slope to attack the French artillery. Then, with their horses blown, they made their way slowly back to the Allied lines, but were attacked on all sides by French cavalry. Nearly half their number failed to return. As the hours passed, the French continued to pound the Allied lines with their artillery, causing great damage. And at some point in the afternoon, Wellington ordered his men onto the reverse side of the slope to lie down to lessen their casualties. Sensing a retreat, the French attacked with some 10,000 cavalry, who charged in lines of 150 strong horsemen. As the lines entered the bottleneck between Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, the outer riders moved in, and the men in the centre later wrote of being lifted off the ground by the crush of riders, their horses' legs flailing in the air, until the farms were passed and the line spread out again. The Allied infantry formed square to meet the repeated waves of cavalry, who charged up the hills countless times to no avail, as the squares held firm despite the losses sustained from continuous French artillery. When the cavalry finally withdrew exhausted, Napoleon sent forward his elite Imperial Guard at around 6 in the evening. 3 great columns of men marched towards the Allies, but by now the sound of gunfire from the approaching Prussians could be heard as they marched from the woods to attack Napoleon at Place Noire. Once more the British line held firm. The French once more ground to a halt and slowly withdrew. Wellington, sensing the moment, ordered the Allies to advance, and joined by increasing numbers of Prussians, pursued the French from the battlefield. The battle had cost the Prussians and Allies some 25,000 dead or wounded, and the French the same number. And as Wellington would later say of it, it was the closest run thing you ever saw in your life.
Je suis Wellington.
The Allies marched on to Paris, and France would be returned to a monarchy. And Napoleon was caught by the Royal Navy off the coast of Rochefort, trying to escape to America, was to be exiled once more, but this time to the distant, tiny mid-Atlantic island of St. Helena, where he would die some years later at the age of 52. The Battle of Waterloo marked the end of the Napoleonic era, and peace was to break out in Europe that would last for 100 years.